Evil is one of the oldest and most powerful arguments ever raised against the existence of God. For centuries, philosophers, skeptics, and ordinary people have asked the same haunting question. If God exists, and if God is good, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? This question does not come from abstract theory. It comes from the places in life where we bleed. From loss, from trauma, from grief, from the moments in which the world feels unbearably cruel. And because the question rises out of pain, it carries immense emotional force. Before anyone debates the logic of the problem of evil, we must first acknowledge something essential. The emotional problem of evil is profound, universal, and deeply human. Even the most rigorous philosophical arguments offer little comfort when someone is in the middle of suffering. Logical explanations do not erase the ache of losing a child, witnessing injustice, or confronting tragedy. But emotions and logic are not the same thing. The emotional problem of evil can make belief in God feel difficult. But the logical problem of evil attempts to show that belief in God is impossible, that the existence of evil contradicts the existence of an all-powerful, all-good God. And that is where the discussion becomes philosophical. This video is not about dismissing the emotional weight of suffering. Instead, it is about carefully and honestly asking whether the existence of evil actually disproves God, as many people assume. Chapter 1: The Emotional Power of Evil and Why the Problem Matters. At first glance, evil certainly seems to count as strong evidence against God. After all, if God is perfectly good, shouldn't he eliminate evil? And if he is all-powerful, couldn't he do so? This leads many critics to claim that the world we observe is inconsistent with the God of classical theism. But when we examine this claim more closely, we discover something surprising. The argument that evil disproves God is much weaker than it appears. In fact, as we will see later, the existence of evil raises deep questions that atheism itself cannot answer. The first step is to distinguish two very different versions of the argument. The logical problem of evil. Evil and God cannot exist simultaneously, a strict contradiction. The evidential problem of evil. Even if it's not a contradiction, the sheer amount of evil makes God unlikely. These are not the same argument, and each must be evaluated separately. We begin with the first. Chapter 2: The logical problem of evil is already dead. For decades, the logical problem of evil was considered the strongest challenge to theism. The atheist philosopher J. L. Mackie formulated it as a simple syllogism. If God is all-powerful, he can eliminate evil. If God is all-good, he wants to eliminate evil. Evil exists. Therefore, God does not exist. At first, this argument seems airtight, but hidden within it are several unstated assumptions that collapse under careful scrutiny. The key question is this: is there a logically possible world in which God exists and evil exists? If the answer is yes, then the logical problem of evil fails. Because the argument requires a strict contradiction, something like a square circle or a married bachelor. The breakthrough came from philosopher Alvin Plantinga and his now famous free will defense. Plantinga argued that it is logically possible that God could not create a world with creatures who have genuine free will and simultaneously guarantee that they would always freely choose the good. In other words, God can create free beings. God can desire that they freely choose good. But God cannot cause them to freely choose good, because that is a contradiction in terms. A choice that is caused is not free. Plantinga's argument does not attempt to explain all evil. It simply shows that there is no contradiction between God's existence and the existence of evil. All that is needed is a single logically possible scenario in which God and evil coexist. And Plantinga demonstrated one. Even atheist philosophers today widely acknowledge this point. In academic philosophy, the logical problem of evil is considered effectively resolved. Here are a few representative conclusions from prominent non-theistic philosophers. William Rowe. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of the theistic God. No one has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. Peter van Inwagen. The free will defense refuted the logical problem of evil once and for all. Gram Oppie. It is widely agreed that the logical argument from evil is unsuccessful. This is not a religious conclusion. It is an academic one. So the supposed contradiction between God and evil is simply not there. The argument fails at a basic logical level. But even if the logical contradiction does not exist, critics often retreat to a different version. Sure, it's not impossible for God and evil to coexist, but isn't it unlikely? This leads us to the evidential problem of evil, which is far more subtle and far more interesting. Chapter 3: The evidential problem of evil and its hidden assumptions. Even though most philosophers agree that the logical problem of evil has failed, many people still feel that evil makes God less probable. This gives rise to the evidential problem of evil, the claim that while God and evil are not logically incompatible, the amount, intensity, or distribution of evil in the world makes God unlikely. This argument is often associated with philosopher William Rowe, who proposed what is now called the faun in the forest example. A faun is trapped in a forest fire, suffers horribly for days, and dies alone. No one sees it, no one learns from it. It produces no apparent good. Rowe argues that this is an example of what he calls gratuitous evil, evil that is seemingly pointless. And if pointless evil exists, then maybe God does not exist. A loving, powerful God, it is argued, would prevent evil that serves no purpose. At first, this line of reasoning seems intuitive, but it rests on several assumptions that crumble upon examination. Let's break them down. 1. The evidential argument assumes we can recognize pointless evil, but can we? Rowe's conclusion depends on the claim that some evils appear gratuitous, and therefore probably are gratuitous. The logic is simple. We cannot see any good reason for this evil. Therefore, there probably is no good reason. This type of reasoning is what philosophers call a nauseam inference. If you look into a tent and see no elephants, it is reasonable to conclude there are no elephants. But if you look into a forest and see no mosquitoes, it would be foolish to conclude there are none. It depends entirely on whether you are in a position to know what to look for. This is where Rowe's argument collapses. To claim that God's reasons do not exist because we cannot see them assumes that human beings have a vantage point similar to God's, that we can grasp all implications, ripple effects, long-term consequences, and hidden connections of every event in the universe. But that is clearly impossible. A universe governed by billions of interacting free agents and natural processes is a universe filled with causal chains so complex that no human mind, not even all human minds combined, could possibly trace them. The claim, "I cannot imagine a reason," is not evidence of anything. It tells us far more about human cognitive limits than about God. To put it bluntly, we are not in a position to judge whether any particular instance of evil is truly pointless. And if we cannot judge that, then the evidential argument cannot get off the ground. 2. The argument assumes God's purposes would be obvious, but why think that? Many critics of theism assume that if God exists, his purposes must be instantly observable, immediately understandable, emotionally satisfying, aligned with our preferences. But this assumption is not only unwarranted, it is deeply unrealistic. Imagine trying to explain the value of surgery to a 3-year-old. Imagine trying to explain the purpose of a complex scientific experiment to an ant. The cognitive gap between God and humanity is infinitely greater. This is not an appeal to mystery. It is an appeal to epistemic humility, the recognition that finite creatures in a vast universe cannot expect to grasp the totality of God's moral reasoning. As philosopher Stephen Dijkstra famously argued, if God is infinitely knowledgeable and morally perfect, then there is no reason to expect that his reasons for permitting evil would be transparent to us. Dijkstra put it simply: if God exists, we should expect there to be goods beyond our understanding. The fact that we can't see God's reasons is exactly what we would expect if God exists. 3. The argument relies on probability calculations that we cannot actually perform. Rowe's evidential argument claims that evil makes God less probable. But to evaluate that claim, one would need to estimate the probability that God exists given the amount and types of evil. The probability that God would have morally sufficient reasons. The probability that we would be able to identify those reasons. The probability that a world with free creatures could be better if structured differently. None of these values are measurable, not even in principle. In fact, as Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig both argue, the presence of evil may be perfectly compatible, or even expected, in a world where God aims to create free beings capable of moral growth, love, courage, and virtue. Given our limited perspective, we simply cannot calculate which world would contain more good overall. The evidential argument asks humans to assign probabilities about realities beyond empirical access or conceptual grasp. That is not a rational demand. 4. The argument overlooks the distinction between global evil and local evil. Local evil. I do not see the purpose of this particular tragedy. Global evil. What is the overall structure of the world, and does it serve a moral purpose? There may be countless local evils whose particular purpose is hidden from us, while the global moral trajectory of reality is still meaningful and coherent. A single pixel may look senseless, until you zoom out and see the entire picture. The evidential argument often fixates on local evils while ignoring the possibility of a global narrative whose structure we do not yet see. 5. The presence of evil is not enough to infer God's non-existence. Alternative theistic explanations exist. A philosophical argument fails if the opponent can show even a single plausible alternative explanation for the same data. And theists offer several. Free will. The reality of moral responsibility. The value of soul-making. The development of virtues, courage, compassion, sacrifice. The interconnected structure of human history. The nature of love, which requires freedom. The possibility of an afterlife where justice is fully realized. The existence of these alternative explanations means that evil cannot simply be assumed to count against God in a probabilistic way. Conclusion of Chapter 3. The evidential problem of evil appears initially compelling, but only because it trades on several unexamined assumptions. That humans can detect pointless evil. That God's purposes must be obvious to us. That we can calculate cosmic probabilities. That there is no larger narrative structure to reality. That theists have no plausible explanations for evil. Once these assumptions are questioned, the argument loses its force. And now we arrive at a pivotal moment in the discussion. If evil does not logically contradict God, and if evil does not probabilistically undermine God, then what exactly is the relationship between evil and God? This leads us to a surprising, often overlooked fact. If God does not exist, then the very concept of evil collapses. Chapter 4. If God doesn't exist, evil becomes meaningless. Up to this point, we have examined whether evil contradicts God, or whether evil makes God unlikely. But now we must confront a deeper and far more uncomfortable question. What does evil even mean if God does not exist? Many people use the problem of evil as an argument against God. But this argument quietly assumes something that atheism cannot provide: the existence of objective moral values. In other words, for evil to count against God, evil must be real, not just a matter of personal opinion. It must be something that truly ought not to exist. It must be objectively wrong, regardless of what any human being thinks. If evil is merely a subjective preference, like disliking a type of food, then it cannot be used as evidence against God. Preferences do not need to be explained by a deity. But almost no one believes evil is subjective. When we say genocide is evil, or human trafficking is evil, or torturing a child is evil, we mean that these things are wrong in themselves, not just wrong for me. We mean they are morally wrong even if a society approves of them, a government legislates them, an individual feels no guilt. An entire culture is blind to their wickedness. This is what philosophers call objective moral realism, the idea that moral truth exists independently of human opinion. And here is the crucial point. Objective moral values cannot exist in a godless universe. 1. If God does not exist, morality becomes evolutionary, subjective, or illusory. Consider the three major secular foundations for morality. A. Evolutionary ethics. On this view, morality is a product of natural selection. Our moral impulses evolved because they increased survival. Right and wrong are nothing more than adaptive behaviors. But if morality evolved through blind, amoral processes, then moral values are not truths at all, they are simply survival strategies. Just as animals have instincts for self-preservation, humans have instincts for cooperation. But instincts are not moral obligations. Survival value does not equal moral truth. If evolution had selected for cruelty instead of cooperation, then cruelty would feel right, but it would still have no objective moral status. Thus, evolutionary ethics destroys the very thing required for the problem of evil, an objective moral standard by which evil is evil. B. Social or cultural moral relativism. If morality is shaped entirely by culture, then moral rules are nothing more than social conventions, like driving on the left or the right side of the road. And moral disagreement is simply a conflict of preferences. But in this view, no culture can judge another. You could not say that the Holocaust, slavery, or genocide was objectively wrong, only that you personally do not prefer it. The argument from evil collapses because evil becomes nothing more than things I dislike. C. Individual moral subjectivism. On this view, morality is determined by personal preference. But then the problem of evil becomes trivial. God doesn't exist because the universe does things I don't like. That is not a rational argument. It is an emotional reaction. 2. Without God, there is no standard to judge anything as evil. To call something evil is to compare it to a standard of goodness, a standard that is higher than any individual, society, or natural process. But what could serve as that standard in a purely material universe? Matter cannot generate moral truth. Particles cannot generate moral duties. Physics cannot tell anyone how they ought to act. If the universe is nothing more than atoms in motion, then morality is just a set of human opinions floating on top of a purposeless cosmos. In such a world, the universe doesn't care about suffering. Nature has no moral agenda. Humans have no inherent dignity. Evil is just a label we emotionally attach to things we dislike. In a godless world, the fawn in the forest fire is not evil. It is just nature happening. The entire force of the problem of evil depends on the claim that evil is real in an objective, meaningful sense, but atheism cannot support this claim. 3. Atheists who use the problem of evil implicitly borrow from theism. This is what C.S. Lewis discovered. Before his conversion, Lewis argued that evil disproved God. He famously wrote, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust?" Lewis realized that his ability to call the world unjust presupposed a standard of justice, one that naturalism could not provide. He concluded, "A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. The straight line, the standard, is what atheism cannot supply." When atheists call something evil, they implicitly appeal to a universal moral law that transcends human opinion. But such a law fits perfectly within a theistic framework. If God exists, moral values are grounded in his nature. They reflect his character. They are not arbitrary. They are binding on all human beings. Without God, there is no moral lawgiver, and therefore no moral law. Thus, atheism undermines the very concept of evil that it uses as evidence against God. 4. Evil makes sense only if goodness exists, and goodness is not grounded in nature. When we label something evil, we imply that it falls short of what ought to be. But the concept of ought does not fit within a purely materialistic worldview. You cannot get ought from physics, chemistry, biology, evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, or sociology. These fields describe what is. None of them can tell you what ought to be. But the moment you say, "This should not happen. This is wrong. This is unjust," you are stepping into the domain of morality, a domain that is grounded in the nature of God. Without God, the concept of evil dissolves into mist. Without an objective moral standard, the word evil loses meaning. Thus we face a profound irony. The problem of evil cannot even be formulated without borrowing from the reality of God. 5. Evil does not undermine God, evil requires God. This conclusion may be uncomfortable for some, but it is logically unavoidable. For evil to exist in any meaningful, objective sense, there must be a real standard of goodness. That standard must be universal, binding, and independent of human opinion. It must transcend biological evolution, culture, and individual preference. The only adequate foundation for such a standard is the moral nature of God. Thus, the existence of evil does not point away from God. It points toward God as the foundation of moral reality. Far from undermining theism, the very concept of evil presupposes the existence of a transcendent moral lawgiver. In this sense, evil is not evidence against God. Evil is evidence that moral truth exists. And moral truth points directly to God. But this raises one last question. If evil does not contradict God, and if evil cannot even be defined without God, then why does God allow evil in the first place? To answer this, we must examine the deeper structure of human freedom, moral growth, and the purpose of creation. This brings us to the next chapter. Chapter 5. A more coherent understanding of God, freedom, and evil. Up to this point, we have seen that evil does not logically contradict God's existence, nor does it probabilistically undermine God, nor can it even be defined without a transcendent moral standard grounded in God. But this still leaves a crucial question that every honest person must eventually confront. Why would a good and all-powerful God allow evil at all? This is the central question behind the problem of evil, and answering it requires a careful understanding of the nature of God, the nature of freedom, and the purpose of human existence. To address this question responsibly, we must avoid simplistic explanations. The interaction between divine sovereignty, human freedom, and moral development is deep, intricate, and touches on the very meaning of life. Let's explore several key principles that help make sense of why a world containing evil may actually be morally superior to a world with none. 1. Free beings are capable of the greatest goods, but also the possibility of evil. One of the most important insights in Christian philosophy is that free will is intrinsically valuable. A world of creatures who can freely love, choose, act, create, and commit themselves to the good is far more valuable than a world of pre-programmed robots. Love without freedom is not love. Courage without risk is not courage. Compassion without suffering is not compassion. Generosity without cost is not generosity. Freedom is what allows for moral agency, responsibility, and personhood. But the possibility of evil is inseparable from the gift of freedom. It is impossible, even for God, to cause a free creature to always freely choose the good. As Alvin Plantinga demonstrated, this is a logical contradiction. God can create free beings. God can invite, guide, command, warn, and teach them. But God cannot force them to freely choose good. That destroys freedom. Thus, a world with freedom necessarily includes the possibility of moral evil. But the value of freedom outweighs the cost of that possibility. Because freedom is what makes creatures capable of the very goods God desires for them: love, virtue, relationship, and genuine moral growth. 2. A world with moral responsibility is better than a world without it. If God eliminated all evil, immediately, automatically, and universally, then moral choice would have no weight. Every choice would be insulated from consequences. Without consequences, there is no responsibility. No character formation. No meaningful good or evil. No significance in choosing right or wrong. To eliminate the consequences of evil would be to eliminate morality itself. The question is not simply, why doesn't God stop evil? The deeper question is, can a morally meaningful world exist if God prevents every evil consequence? The answer is no. A world without consequences is a world without morality. 3. Some goods can only exist in a world where evil is possible. This point is called the greater good principle, but it is widely misunderstood. It does not mean that every instance of evil has an immediately visible purpose. Instead, it means that certain profoundly important goods can exist only in a world where evil is possible or actual. For example, courage can exist only in the presence of danger. Patience can exist only through difficulty. Forgiveness can exist only when someone has been wronged. Mercy can exist only where there is fault. Sacrifice can exist only where there is cost. Compassion can exist only where someone suffers. These goods are not trivial. They are among the highest moral values known to humanity. A world without evil would be a world without these goods, a world less rich, less meaningful, and less morally profound. 4. Suffering is often connected to long-term goods we cannot foresee. The evidential problem of evil assumes that if we cannot see a reason for some suffering, then there probably is no reason. But our perspective is extraordinarily limited. We cannot trace every causal chain, see every ripple effect across history, understand the personal growth produced by adversity, predict how future lives will be impacted, know how one tragedy may prevent another, or see the eternal significance of temporary suffering. The point is not that every event has an obvious or satisfying purpose. The point is that we lack the vantage point to judge that it does not. God may permit some suffering because it is connected to goods we cannot yet see, goods that may unfold years later, generations later, or even in eternity. 5. The soul-making dimension of reality. The philosopher John Hick famously emphasized the soul-making aspect of human life. According to this view, the world is not primarily a place of comfort, it is a place of formation, a moral arena in which character, virtue, and spiritual maturity take shape. This does not mean suffering is good in itself. But it does mean that suffering often produces good. Many of the most profound individuals in history became who they were: strong, wise, compassionate, courageous, precisely because of the suffering they endured. A world completely free of hardship might produce comfort, but it would not produce heroism, compassion, resilience, wisdom, or self-giving love. In a world with no challenges, no one could grow. No one could mature. No one could overcome. No one could demonstrate moral greatness. The soul-making process requires a world in which the challenges of life refine and transform us. 6. Natural laws make meaningful action possible, but they also allow suffering. Natural laws must be stable, predictable, and consistent for any meaningful action to be possible. For example, fire burns. Gravity pulls. Water can drown. The laws of biology govern our cells. The laws of chemistry govern reactions. The laws of physics govern motion. These stable laws enable building, reasoning, technology, agriculture, learning, planning, the continuity of life. A world where fire sometimes burns and sometimes heals, unpredictably, would be chaotic and uninhabitable. But these same laws occasionally produce natural suffering: fires, earthquakes, diseases, storms. Natural laws produce a world that is coherent and intelligible. But they also produce a world in which suffering is possible. God could override natural laws at every moment to prevent bad outcomes. But doing so would render the world unintelligible and destroy the possibility of meaningful action. A stable, law-governed world necessarily comes with risks, and with opportunities for nobility, heroism, and responsibility. 7. God may prioritize the creation of a maximally good world, not a maximally comfortable world. The assumption behind the problem of evil is often this: if God were good, he would create the most comfortable world possible. But this confuses two very different goals. A world that minimizes suffering versus a world that maximizes meaning, virtue, freedom, relationship, and eternal destiny. The first produces comfort. The second produces greatness. God may well desire a world in which human beings become noble, virtuous, compassionate, strong, loving, and capable of entering into eternal communion with Him. Comfort alone cannot produce these qualities. A gym with no resistance produces no strength. A school with no challenges produces no wisdom. A life with no responsibility produces no character. A world with no possibility of evil would not be a paradise, it would be a moral vacuum. 8. Temporary suffering may be justified by eternal outcomes. If this earthly life is all there is, then the problem of evil feels overwhelming. But if eternal life is real, then the meaning of earthly suffering changes dramatically. Finite suffering can be justified by infinite good. This is not a glib or simplistic answer. It is a philosophical recognition that if life continues beyond death, then earthly suffering may play a role in shaping eternal destinies, in ways we cannot fully understand now. Every major Christian thinker has affirmed that the ultimate resolution to evil lies not in this life, but in the life to come. If eternal life exists, then every injustice, every moment of grief, every tragedy can ultimately be redeemed, compensated, and transformed. The problem of evil looks entirely different in a universe where death is not the end. Conclusion of Part 4. We are now in a position to see the deeper structure of the problem. God values freedom. God values genuine moral growth. God values love, courage, compassion, and sacrifice. God values a law-governed world where humans can act meaningfully. God values eternal life more than temporary comfort. And because of these values, God may have morally sufficient reasons to permit evil, even if those reasons are sometimes beyond our understanding. Evil does not contradict God. Evil does not undermine God. Evil fits within a coherent moral universe created by God. But our exploration is not complete. We must now turn to the final layer of the argument, drawing together the logical, philosophical, moral, and existential insights into a unified conclusion. Chapter 5. A more coherent understanding of God, freedom, and evil. We have now explored several major themes that make sense of why a good God might allow evil. But to tie everything together, we need to step back and look at the broader picture, the overarching logic behind all these pieces. What emerges is a unified, coherent, and philosophically rich understanding of evil and its place in God's world. Let's bring the argument home. 9. A world without the possibility of evil would also be a world without the highest goods. People sometimes imagine that God could have created a world with no possibility of evil, a world where every decision is pleasant, every outcome harmless, and every event safe. But such a world would come at a tremendous cost. For example, there could be no courage, because courage requires danger. There could be no compassion, because compassion requires suffering to respond to. There could be no forgiveness, because forgiveness requires wrongdoing. There could be no moral responsibility, because responsibility requires consequences. There could be no real love, because love requires the possibility of rejection. A world in which no one can harm anyone else would also be a world in which no one can meaningfully help anyone else. A world without risk is a world without growth. A world without challenge is a world without character. A morally significant universe must contain real freedom, real choices, real consequences, and therefore real evil. A perfectly safe world would not be a moral world, it would be a morally vacuous one. 10. The drama of redemption gives ultimate meaning to suffering. Within the Christian worldview, evil is not the end of the story. If suffering existed without hope, without redemption, without justice, and without transformation, then the problem of evil would be truly devastating. But Christianity affirms three truths that change the entire framework. A. Suffering can be redeemed. It can produce growth, character, wisdom, and compassion. B. Justice will ultimately be done. No evil escapes the moral accounting of God. C. Death is not the end. This life is not the full story of human existence. Earthly suffering, no matter how intense, is temporary in the light of eternity. These truths do not trivialize suffering, they contextualize it. A story can contain sorrow and still be good if the sorrow has a purpose and the ending is glorious. Christianity does not deny the reality of evil. It denies that evil will have the final word. 11. The existence of evil is fully compatible with the existence of God. When all the pieces are assembled, the argument becomes clear. A. The logical problem of evil fails. There is no contradiction between God and evil. B. The evidential problem of evil depends on assumptions humans cannot justify. We are not in a position to judge that any given evil is pointless. C. Evil requires an objective moral standard. But atheism cannot provide such a standard. D. The only coherent foundation for objective morality is God. Thus, evil actually presupposes God. E. God may have morally sufficient reasons to allow evil. Reasons connected to freedom, character, meaning, and destiny. Once these conclusions are accepted, the force of the problem of evil evaporates. Not because evil is less serious, but because the argument against God was built on unstable foundations from the beginning. 12. Evil is not evidence against God. It is a feature of a world designed for freedom and growth. A universe without evil would not be a universe of moral beauty. It would be an empty stage with no drama, no conflict, and no meaning. God did not create a world of artificial harmony. He created a world of moral significance. In such a world, choices matter. Actions have consequences. Virtues are real achievements. And relationships are freely chosen. The presence of evil is not a sign of divine absence. It is a sign that God gave humanity the dignity of genuine freedom. 13. Evil reminds us that this world is not the final state. Atheism must face a sobering reality. If there is no God, evil will never be defeated. It will simply continue indefinitely until the universe ends in entropy. There will be no justice, no redemption, no restoration. But the Christian worldview affirms something radically different. Evil is real. Evil is serious. Evil is destructive. But evil is temporary. The presence of evil points us forward, toward a hope that lies beyond the limits of this life. Toward a world where every tear will be wiped away, and toward a God who ultimately restores all things. 14. The problem of evil is not just an objection, it is a clue. When we recoil at suffering, injustice, cruelty, or oppression, we are not simply expressing emotion. We are recognizing that something is violated, something moral, something universal, something objective. Our outrage at evil is not a coincidence. It is not a product of blind evolution. It is not a subjective preference. It is the echo of a moral law written into the human heart. That echo is a clue. A clue that justice is real. Goodness is real. Moral value is real. And therefore, the source of moral value, God, is real. The argument from evil does not refute God. Properly understood, it points toward Him. Grand conclusion. We began with a difficult question. Is evil evidence against God? After examining the logical structure, the evidential claims, the moral implications, and the existential realities, we can now answer. No, evil is not evidence against God. The logical problem fails. The evidential problem collapses. The moral argument turns the tables. The existence of evil becomes intelligible only in a theistic world. And the purposes of God, though sometimes hidden, offer coherent reasons for why evil might be permitted. A world with no possibility of evil would also be a world with no possibility of the highest goods. God desires a world of freedom, growth, moral responsibility, and eternal destiny, a world where love is real and where virtue matters. And within that world, evil is not a contradiction. It is a tragic but necessary possibility within a morally meaningful universe. Evil does not disprove God. Evil testifies to the reality of goodness. And goodness points directly to God. This is the paradox at the heart of the human condition. We recognize evil because we were made for good. We long for justice because justice is real. We cry out against suffering because God made us to know that the world is not yet as it should be. Evil is not a reason to abandon God. It is a reason to seek Him.